Pretty incredible thought, isn't it? Remember doubting Thomas? He didn't want to believe, and he said, unless I touch the hands and feet of Jesus. And he did. And he bowed down. He said, my Lord and my God. And Jesus said to Thomas, he said, you have seen and touched and believed. Blessed are those who come after you who have not seen and yet believed. I think that probably Jesus had us on his mind. If you have your Bibles, will you turn with me to Exodus chapter 12? I texted Mike yesterday and I said, Mike, round 10, will you be there? He said, I'll be there. Exodus chapter 12, Moses, in giving us the narrative of the children of Israel in Egypt and the plagues, he gave us 9 in a row, and then he stopped and took a little break, and he gave us the preparation for round 10, for the Passover. And last week we celebrated together the Passover in the beginning of Exodus chapter 12. We finished and we ended last week with the Israelites there in their home. They were dressed in their traveling clothes with their walking sticks in hand, just waiting. God had told Moses that it was going to happen at midnight. Caitlin missed a couple weeks ago. Hey, Caitlin. And she said, did it ever really happen? She said that God said it was going to happen. Did it ever really happen? Well, Caitlin, it happens today. Exodus chapter 12, we start with verse 29. This message this morning is called Round 10, the Exodus. We're studying the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus is about the children of Israel exiting out of Egypt. And we've been talking about it. Today is the Exodus out of Egypt, round 10. By the way, what's the score at this point, Mike? It's 9-0. God has delivered 9 punches to Pharaoh and said, Pharaoh, please, I'm telling you to let my people go. And Pharaoh continued to refuse. The score is 9-0. We got one more. Verse 29, it happened. Now at midnight the Lord struck every firstborn male in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and every firstborn of the livestock. You know, it's kind of hard to celebrate that, isn't it? That sure is a sobering reality. I've got some points this morning. I want to offer you this first one. Your firstborn is worth your obedience to Yahweh.
Amen. Amen. That's right.
Because for 9 rounds now, Pharaoh had the opportunity at any time to where he could have said, okay, I will choose to submit my will to God's will. And in doing so, preserve the life of my firstborn. And he didn't do it. Your firstborn is worth your obedience to God. And so is your secondborn. So is your thirdborn. So is your fourthborn. From the Pharaoh to the prisoner, and I would say to you that we're watching that. I say this humbly. We're watching that happen in our culture today in a bunch of ways. Those false gods become addictive. For Pharaoh, it was the perception of power. He was addicted to it. For us, it appears to be the addictions to money or to success or to drugs or alcohol or pornography, or in some cases to work or to material possessions or to some other activities. From the Pharaoh to the prisoner in prison, no one was exempt. There are no protected classes. The enemy's aspiration to bring decay and destruction and death has no social boundaries or economic or ethnic boundaries. No one is exempt, not in my home. Not yours. My challenge to you today as head of family is to completely obey and worship God. It will not only preserve your children and your family, it will preserve the children and the families of those around you. Pharaoh's decision didn't just affect him, it didn't just affect his family, it affected everybody in Egypt because of his disobedience. In America, there's a fierce battle for our firstborn, and our secondborn, and our thirdborn. Satan's after your firstborn, but remember, God is after your firstborn too. Remember this verse over in Numbers. This happens, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. This happens later as they're out in the desert. God says to the people, He says, for every firstborn, remember the firstborn that I saved on the night of the Passover back in Exodus chapter 12? Now I'm over in Numbers. Every firstborn among the Israelites is mine. I saved them. I preserved their lives. I want them for my own. Both man and animal. I consecrated them to myself on the day I struck down every firstborn in the land of Egypt. This happened after the Passover. God's reminding them, I protected the life of your firstborn, and I'm asking you to give your firstborn to me. Can I just ask you if you've done that, parents? Have you consecrated and dedicated and given your firstborn and your secondborn and your thirdborn? Have you given them to the Lord? Perhaps you have. Verse 30 goes on and says in Exodus 12, during the night Pharaoh got up, he along with all of his officials and all the Egyptians, and there was a loud wailing throughout Egypt because there wasn't a house without someone dead. Caitlin, it was not a pretty scene that night. It was not, last week we celebrated with the Passover, but it was not a pretty scene in Egypt that night. A mom woke up, a Pharaoh woke up to know that his firstborn was dead. I just say to you that the second point that I would give to you is that the path of disobedience will take you farther than you want to go. This final destruction, it snuck up on Pharaoh. Pharaoh would never have intentionally set out to have this happen to his children, but he did. In stubbornness and in disobedience, we see it over and over. There is often a slow fade. It was not someone making a decision to bring destruction on their home. It was just a slow fade from this close relationship to the Lord to just stepping back a little bit, to just stepping back a little bit, to just stepping back a little bit farther until sin has taken you farther than you want to go. The loud wailing was the realization that their stubborn disobedience had gone too far in their lives. It took Pharaoh a whole lot farther than he ever wanted to go. You know what? We're almost done with round 10. It's a sobering, I've said all along, when the people march out of Egypt, we're going to celebrate. Right now, what's happening is that God is bringing judgment on the people because of their disobedience, the people of Egypt. Verses 31, 32. In the middle of the night, Pharaoh, summoned Moses and Aaron during the night and said, get up, leave my people, both you and the Israelites, and go worship Yahweh as you've asked. Take even your flocks and your herds as you've asked. And also, would you bless me? Pretty remarkable. The Holman Christian Standard Study Bible says, I think I have that up here, Pharaoh had one last encounter with Moses and Aaron. Do you remember the last time Pharaoh talked to Moses? He said, Moses, never come in my sight again, because the next time I see you, you will surely die. But the Study Bible says that he had declared Moses would die if they met again, but he could not keep that resolve in the middle of the night. Moses! I started to play the clip. I don't know if you've seen the Bible, the story, the reenactment of Pharaoh and his little boy, and the night that this happened, and Pharaoh leaning over his son and calling out, Moses! Get out! Take your people! Take your livestock! Go! I never want to see you again. I would say, offer to you that Pharaoh is not necessarily turning to God. Rather, he's trying to get the bearer of truth away from him. Incredibly, ironically, the last thing Pharaoh does is ask, oh, by the way, would you ask Yahweh to bless me? Now, it's a little late for Pharaoh for you to ask God to bless you. Pharaoh says, I know that God is in charge. I know that I could have avoided this destruction by submitting myself to Him. I've known what to do. I'm going to do it now, but only because I want to avoid further destruction. I have decided, can you imagine Pharaoh? I have decided, this is the political spin, I have decided after examining all of the facts to completely and totally do exactly what you asked me to do to begin with. I've made my decision to let your people go. By the way, if you don't mind, would you ask Yahweh to bless them? Number 2, the path of disobedience will take you farther than you want to go. Verse 33, now the Egyptians pressured the people in the middle of the night in order to send them out quickly out of the country, for they said, we're all going to die. Point number 3, the path of disobedience will cost those around you more than you want them to pay. Because we don't live on an island, do we? We don't worship in an island. We don't serve God in an island. We're not part of a community on an island. There are people around us that are affected. The Egyptians, this time the Egyptians were caught in the political crosshairs of their leadership. We see that happening in the world on television all the time today, don't we? In countries where the people are caught in the crosshairs of the political leadership. What an excruciating cry this must have been from the Egyptians who lived around Israel. Please leave. Just go. Get out of here. We really don't care what Pharaoh says. We're telling you to go before we die. Leave quickly. Do whatever. We'll do whatever it takes to get you out of here. How can we help? And those Egyptians were left behind to begin the process of mourning their dead. Not only was their land devastated, but now their children were dead. And there, Mike, is your final score. It's hard to gloat over. It was a devastatingly painful defeat, but the final score was 10-0. God. Now imagine if you were to ask the Egyptians that night, they would have called it more like 1,000 to nothing. Completely destroyed. And so I will say to you, at this point, in Exodus chapter 12, the narrative changes. The focus for these past weeks and weeks has been on Pharaoh in Egypt. Instead, right here, the focus turns to the exodus of the children of Israel out of the nation of Egypt. Verse 34. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, with their kneading bowls wrapped up in their clothes on their shoulders. I'd offer you number 4. Be flexible and nimble and ready to go when God says go. Moses had told them to whip up some dough, but because it was unleavened, you won't have time for it to rise and make it unleavened. Do you remember this verse out of Hebrews 12? Therefore, since we have such a large cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that so easily besets us. Let us take the weights off. Let's take the extra stuff. Let's take the baggage off so that we'll be nimble and ready to go when God says go. Let us run with race. Let us run with endurance the race that lies out before us. I'm going to ask you this question this morning. Are you stuck where you are at? If God says go, are you ready to go? How tightly are you tied to where you are? After getting beat again yesterday in the sack race by Noah Rosser, he beat me about 3 times. I said to him, I said, no, I don't tell Noah this, but a couple times I was trying to beat him in that sack race and I getting hops fast. Don't tell him I said that. Out of the mouths of babes. I said to him, I said, Noah, I said, you beat me over and over. How are you able to do that? You know what Noah said? He said, I just stayed focused on the race. I said, that'll preach. That'll preach, Joe. Noah, how old are you anyway, son? 6? I was able to win because I just stayed focused on the race. I didn't get bogged down by the weights, and I didn't get distracted by looking and seeing how the people were running beside me were running. And I didn't wear those crazy glasses that they gave us to wear because that was extra weight. I stayed focused on the race. Be flexible and nimble and ready to move when God says go. Verses 35 and 36, the Israelites acted on Moses' word and asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. And the Lord gave the people such favor in the Egyptian sight that they gave them what they requested. In this way, they plundered the Egyptians. Goodness gracious. Can I just give you number 5? I've talked about it several times. Humbly accept God's favor. Remember these verses? God had predicted this was going to happen in Exodus chapter 3. And I will give these people such favor in the sight of the Egyptians that when you go, you won't go empty-handed. Each woman will ask her neighbor and any woman staying in her house for silver and gold jewelry and clothing, and you will put them on your sons and daughters. In such doing, you will plunder the Egyptians. Then these verses, he says it again over in chapter 11, verses 2 and 3. Now announce to the people that both men and women should ask their neighbors for silver and gold jewelry. The Lord, repeated, the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and the man Moses was highly regarded in the land of Egypt by Pharaoh's officials, the people. The people had decided, man, we sure wish Moses was our leader instead of Pharaoh. But God had predicted twice, you're going to ask for those folks. You're going to ask them for gold and silver and for clothing, and they're going to give them to you. Honestly, may I just ask you, being transparent, can I just be transparent? Do you sometimes want to plunder the enemy? Sometimes I'd like to plunder the enemy. Remember the psalmist David saying, why do the heathen prosper? God, why do they prosper? I sure would like to plunder those enemies sometimes. You know what? The truth of the matter is God's richly blessed our lives, has He not? Humbly accept God's favor. Worthy is the Lamb who has blessed us. I asked Mike in the hallway this morning, I hugged him, I said, how are you? And he says what he always says, I'm greatly blessed, highly favored. Remember, the bulk of the Israelites had settled in Ramesses. Let me show you this verse back from Genesis 47. That's when they first went down to Egypt. Joseph settled his father and brothers in the land of Egypt and gave them the property in the best part of the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. That sets us up for verse 37. The Israelites traveled from Ramesses to Succoth. About 600,000 soldiers on foot, besides their families. Now, I'll just tell you that from Ramesses to Succoth is apparently about 25 miles. It would be like walking from here to Greenville in one day. They did that. That next morning, there was wailing in the middle of the night. They got up and they said, get out of here. On day one of their journey, they traveled about 25 miles from here to Greenville on foot. 600,000 men plus children and their wives. 600,000 heads of households. Do you know what that means? That means there were 600,000 lambs or goats that were killed the night before at Passover. There were 600,000 doorposts that had been painted with the blood of that animal that caused that death angel to pass when it got there. 600,000. You add the families and the kids. These were large families. Remember that they went from 70 people. We'll come to that in a second. They started out with 70 people and now they've got 600,000 men. Exodus chapter 1 verse 5 tells us the total number of Jacob's descendants that went down into Egypt was 70. Joseph, I guess he was 71, was already in Egypt. We'll see in a minute how long that they were in Egypt. They went from 70 to probably, very possibly, 2.5 or 3 million people in not very long. Man, you want to talk about God's blessing and fruitfulness on His people. They were. Today there are about 14.7 million Jews, Israelites, worldwide. May I show you this picture of the population from JewishVirtualLibrary.org. In 1925, there were 14.8 million. In 1939, before the World War II started, there were 16.7 million. In 1945, there were 11 million. Almost 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. The numbers had started to turn around slowly. Today, like I said, there were 14.7 million Jews worldwide. On this day, the 2.5 million or whatever it was, they were on the move. It had to be the most terrifying and exhilarating day of their entire lives. Verse 38 tells us pretty amazingly that an ethically diverse crowd also went with them, along with a huge number of livestock, both flocks and herds. Amazing. It wasn't just the Israelites. Apparently, it sounds like there were some other people, probably a whole bunch of Egyptians, who heard about what was happening and heard about the rules and perhaps even heard about the instructions for the Passover. It's entirely possible that many of those Egyptians, that they painted blood on their doorposts and the death angel passed, and many of them, an ethically diverse crowd, went up with Jews. Many people saw the opportunity themselves to escape and get out. of what was happening in Egypt under Pharaoh. Point number 6 that I have to go with this verse is, whosoever will may come. You know, from the very beginning, God never had, He has His chosen people called His, today called His Christians, called His church. That's us. That's us. We're today God's chosen people. But God has always said, whosoever will may come. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. In this thing called the church today, Jesus made it very clear that this new body that was going to come up called the church, there's not going to be male or female or slave or free or Jews or Gentiles. Whosoever comes and trusts on the name of the Lord can be saved and will be a part of this body. Pretty remarkable that it wasn't just the Jews that left Egypt. It was an ethnically diverse crowd. Look at verse 39 with me. The people baked the dough that they'd brought out of Egypt into leavened loaves, since it had no yeast. For when they had been driven out of Egypt, they could not delay and had not prepared any provisions for themselves. We've already talked about the bread dough. We've already talked about the leaven, but I just want you to consider that phrase that they were driven out. They'd been driven out. I offer to you this point. Recognize that a drove out by man is probably a led out by God.
Amen.
Does that happen in your life? That event happens in your life and you're thinking, why, God, did you allow that? Look how I was treated. Look how that person drove me out. And you just want God just saying, I led you out. Nothing happens in your life by accident. I know that all you can see down here are threads, but on the top, on the upper side, I'm drawing this really beautiful picture in your life.
Amen.
Recognize in your life that when a drove out by man may actually be, and probably is, a led out by God. Verses 40 and 41, the time that the Israelites lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that same day, all the Lord's divisions went out from the land of Egypt. I'll offer you point number 8. It might very well take a long time for God to bring the threads of His purpose about in your life. That's not the fun principle, is it? God, would you please, I'm patient. I'm playing for patience. Would you give them to me very quickly? It may be very well true that what God is doing in your life, it will take a long time for God to accomplish that. The Israelites stayed as slaves in Egypt for 430 years. I asked the question, we talked about that at 12 Men a couple of weeks ago. Why did God leave Israel in Egypt that long? And I think it was Greg, some Greg back there. He said, because he had to build a nation. Start out with 70 people. Well, that's not a nation. Well, let's just leave them in Egypt for 400 years and let's let them be fruitful and multiply and grow, and I'll bless them and I'll favor them and I'll create the circumstances by which they're miserable and they want to get out of there, and after 430 years I'll say, okay, it's time. It's pretty remarkable that it said in that verse that it happened on the same day, verse 41, at the end of 430 years on the same day. The Enduring Word Commentary says it's remarkable evidence that God often fulfills promises on anniversaries of prior or prophesied events. What does that mean? Well, let me just give you one. Last week we talked about the Passover happening 4,000 years ago. Remember the day that Jesus died? Right on Passover. No coincidence how God is orchestrating His world. It was definitely a reason to commemorate and celebrate. And so verse 42, the last verse, says it was a night of vigil in honor of the Lord, because He would bring them out of the land of Egypt. This same night, the writer says, is in honor of the Lord a night vigil for all the Israelites throughout generations. The New King James Version says, instead of a night vigil, it says a night of solemn observance. The definition of vigil is a period of keeping awake during the time usually spent asleep, especially to keep watch or pray. Every year, I want you to keep this vigil. Whenever you celebrate this Passover, every night after you celebrate that, I want it to be a night vigil when you remember what happened on that day. That's the day that I led you out of bondage into freedom. The Enduring Word Commentary then tells us that the phrase "out of Egypt" is repeated 56 times. God says over and over and over, "Hey, Israel, do you remember when I led you out of bondage to freedom? Hey, do you remember when I led you out of bondage to freedom?" Over and over and over. Don't forget it. Remember whenever I led you out of bondage into freedom. The picture is, once I was in bondage, now I am free. Once I was blind, now I can see. God never wanted them to get over the night that they were transformed from slaves to free men. I'll just tell you, I'm kind of moved by that phrase, a night vigil to the Lord. You know, on that night after Passover, God said, put your traveling clothes on, grab your walking stick, because it's going to happen at midnight. You know what was happening that night in those homes that had painted blood across their door. You know what was happening with those mamas. You know what was happening with those mamas at midnight, don't you? Knowing that the Passover, the Passover angel, the death angel, was going to pass. Wide awake those moms were, hugging their children up tightly, calling out to God, making sure that they'd followed the Passover instructions just exactly right. Oh God, preserve my boy. Oh God, please preserve my girl. You know that those mamas were wide awake. That's called a night vigil right there. It's a solemn remembrance. Today begins Passover week, Passion Week. Today's Palm Sunday. How often do we celebrate it, commemorate it? Every year. Friday is Good Friday. How often do we commemorate it? Every year. Sunday is Easter Sunday. How often do we commemorate it? Every year. I would say to you, brothers and sisters, this is our week. I don't know what's going on in politics. I don't know what's going on halfway around the world, but I'm telling you that this week as Christians, this is our week. Right. This is celebration week. Friday, I happened to be at North Grove Medical Park, and I was walking down the steps, and it was like I was going down the steps of the elevator in the airport, and there was my mama sitting there looking at me, but it wasn't my mom, it was Miss Carol. She was sitting there in her wheelchair, and I walked down the steps, and she looked up at me, and we made eye contact and talked about why each of us was there, and it was like my mama waiting for me at the airport. And she said, you know, I've been back to the doctor, and the doctor told me one day that I'm going to die. And I said, you know what, I think if I went to the doctor would probably tell me the same thing. One day you're going to die too. And then she said that when that happens, she said, Clayton, she said, I'm going home to see my father. And I'll tell you, you can ask her, I started doing cartwheels around her wheelchair. I thought, Clayton, if the doctor could say to you definitively, Clayton, you have 1 year to live. At the end of that 1 year, you're going to leave here and you're going to go see your father. What would you do, Clayton? And I've been chewing on that all weekend after that conversation with Carol. She said many times, I'm so ready to go meet my father. And I thought if I had 1 year to live, I'd probably love my wife a little bit better. I'd probably be a little bit more patient with drivers on Highway 9. I'd probably be a little more patient in my life. Events that happen in my life that sometimes would rile me up, Brother Norman, I'd probably say, you know what, that's all right. In just a few months, short months, I'm going to see my father. I'd probably be willing to forgive some folks who, if they hurt me and they came at me and they did something wrong to me, I'd probably say, your apology is accepted. I forgive you. It's okay. It's okay, because in just a few months I'm going to see my father and he's forgiven me. That's why I get to go see him to start with. And I thought in my mind, what if the doctor said to me, Clayton, you definitively have 2 years before you're going to go meet your father? What if the doctor said definitively you have 5 years before you're going to go meet your father? Well, I'll probably keep living like I am for a couple years, but before it gets close, I probably want to get ready. Because you know, whenever I meet my father, I probably want to know his story really well. I don't want to get to heaven and embarrass myself and see Peter and say, "Hey, Peter, that sure was a great time whenever you, when we were sure inspired when you were the first martyr." And Peter says, "That wasn't me, that's Stephen, he's over in aisle 22. Or I go talk to Paul's brother Paul, "Oh, the night that you walked on water." Paul says, "That wasn't me, that was Peter, he's over on aisle 24. Now, which ones? Moses and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, which ones are those? And when I'll just kind of feel like when I get to heaven, I'd like to know which one those guys are and be able to shake their hand and talk to them about the stories about how God used their lives in my life to inspire me. What if I had 5 years? What if the doctor could say definitively, "Clayton, you have 10 years left on earth"? Now I find if a doctor could say to me definitively, "Clayton, you don't have a year, you have 6 months." What if the doctor said, "Clayton, you only have 2 months left"? And then I thought, what if the doctor could say to me, "Clayton, I don't have any idea how long you have left. You might die today. You might pass from death." I shouldn't use the word die. Jesus said, "If you live and believe in me, you won't ever die."
Come on.
You might pass from death to life tomorrow. And you might pass from death to life in 20 years. What you going to do, Clayton? What would you do today differently if you knew you were going to die tomorrow? What would you do today differently if you knew that you had 20 years left to live? I wonder if I would have a bunch of night vigils, which I would solemnly remember the glorious cross. I wonder if I would tell people about the good news about what Jesus did for me and therefore what he did for you as well. I wonder if I'd be more enthusiastic about that. So I hope they would be solemn nights of great celebration, and I would say something like, "Jesus paid it all. All to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain. Jesus washed it white as snow." Will you bow your heads? Can I ask you this morning, have you blown it? Have you messed it up? Are you far from God? If your number came up today, would you be ready? Pharaoh had right till the last minute to concede and submit himself to God's purpose. Can I remind you that failure isn't fatal till it's final? There's always a chance to turn back to God. Wherever you are, it's not too late to celebrate what he's done in your life. Greg's going to play this song, "Jesus Paid It All." I'm glad to meet you right here. I know that the God's Spirit can speak to you right where you're at, or to speak to you when your head's on your pillow at night. I know that God's speaking to you because he's speaking to me, speaking to all of us. He's calling all of us to draw closer to a relationship with him.